Hello, my dear friends. If you thought that medieval kings only knew how to rule, marry, have children, and attend banquets, then you probably have never heard of them having sex with corpses, using menstrual blood as a love potion, or demanding sex slaves to serve them even when they were dying. These acts that are considered disgusting, immoral, and even illegal in modern society were once covered up as part of the sacred royal ritual. Each layer of the palace's velvet curtain will gradually be lifted, revealing secrets that will both shock and captivate you. Tonight, let's step into the royal chambers and uncover the darkest side of medieval power. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, we dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If anyone thought medieval royal families only used prayers and herbs to treat their illnesses, they would be wrong. In some courts, when a king or prince got sick with a disease people now believe to be syphilis, he was told to lie with a virgin, not as a matter of pleasure, but as a supposed cure. The belief was simple, but disturbing. It said that the fresh, untouched body of a young girl could pull the sickness out of the royal man and take it into herself. That way, the man would be restored and the disease would be gone. The idea came from fear and desperation. Royal families feared illness more than anything else. Doctors of the time had little understanding of disease, and treatments were often based on superstition or tradition, not science. Some thought bathing in goat's milk would work. Others tried leeches. But when those didn't help, the suggestion to find a virgin was offered like it was medicine. And once the king or prince accepted it, the search began. Girls from poor families were the first ones taken. Some were orphans. Some were daughters of servants. A few were picked up off the streets. No one asked them what they wanted. They were told they had been chosen to help the royal family. That was all. The families who gave them away either had no idea what was going to happen or didn't care. In many cases, they were paid in grain, tools, or fabric. What happened to the girl afterward didn't matter. The girl would be washed, dressed in a clean tunic, and brought into a chamber. The room would have scented candles and soft sheets, as if that made anything better. The man in the bed was usually sweating and weak. Sometimes he was covered in sewers, but she had no choice. She was told to lie beside him. Sometimes it happened once, other times, the girl was made to return again and again, and if the man did not get better, another girl would be brought in to replace her. In those rooms, virginity was not a virtue. It was a tool, like a knife for a sponge. Once the girl was used, she was often discarded. Some were sent to convents. Others were pushed out of the palace with a few coins and told not to come back. A few got pregnant. If that happened, the child was rarely acknowledged. The girl might be punished for it. No one blamed the royal man. The shame always fell on the girl, even though she never had a say in what happened. In some places, the practice became routine. Court officials would quietly keep track of girls who fit the description. They had to be young, healthy, and silent. That last part mattered most. A girl who made noise, asked questions, or cried was considered troublesome. Those who obeyed without question were seen as ideal. Some were used more than once, not because anyone cared for them, but because they'd learned not to resist. Slaves had it even worse. They didn't even need to be tricked or paid. They were just ordered. A nobleman with sores on his body and pain in his joints would call for a slave girl as if calling for food. She would be brought in, sometimes still bruised from previous beatings, and told to please her master. There was no thought of her safety or health. She was not seen as a person. She was a vessel, a tool, something to be used and then sent back to the corner of the palace where the others slept. The fact that these men believed disease could be cured by harming a child shows just how twisted royal thinking could be. In royal medicine, nothing was questioned if it served the man at the top. If a noble or king said it worked, no one argued. Servants followed orders. Guards stood outside the door. No one wrote anything down. No one asked what happened to the girl. As long as the king felt better the next day, everything was considered successful. Some doctors encouraged the practice. A few even said it was a sign of the gods' favor that such a cure existed. These same men would refuse to treat peasants, but had no trouble recommending a poor girl's body as treatment for the royal family. The church, too, stayed silent. They preached purity from the pulpit, but looked away when the king wanted something. No priest ever stopped the process. A few even gave quiet blessings before the act began. Looking at it now, it feels less like history and more like a crime that never got punished. This was not a rare event. It happened in multiple kingdoms with different rulers and under different banners. What they all had in common was power. The kind of power that made everything possible, even the unthinkable. These acts were hidden behind walls and drapes, but everyone in the palace knew. They just chose not to see. By the time the girl left the palace, she was no longer the same. Some returned home with injuries or sickness. Others never spoke again. A few took their own lives, but their stories never made it into books or scrolls. They were forgotten as quickly as they were taken. To the royal men, these girls were like temporary medicine. Once used, they were replaced. As torches burned low in the hallway and the chambers fell quiet, another girl might be standing outside a door, holding her breath, trying to understand what was happening. She would step inside because she was told to. She would do what was asked because she couldn't say no. She would carry the memory, but no one would ever ask her about it. In the next part, we will look at how royal daughters were forced to prove their virginity before marriage, and how honor was often measured by what their bodies could show. The girls who were used as cures for disease were not the only ones whose bodies were controlled by royal customs. Even the daughters of kings and queens had to go through painful and humiliating rituals. A princess might grow up in silk gowns, eat from golden plates, and be taught to speak multiple languages. But before her wedding day, everything came down to one thing: whether her hymen was still intact. The fear of lost honor pushed royal families to demand physical proof of something that should never have been public. In many royal courts, it was required that a princess go through a virginity inspection before her marriage. The ceremony could be formal or quiet, depending on the country and time. But it always involved other people looking at her body, especially the part that should have been left private. She had no say in it. She could not refuse. It didn't matter if she was kind, clever, or loyal. If her body did not match the expectations, she was at risk. These inspections were usually done a few days before the wedding. The girl was taken to a chamber inside the palace. Sometimes her mother or a trusted older servant would be present, but often she was surrounded only by women chosen by the court. The person leading the inspection was called a royal midwife, or in some places, a court physician. But most of them were not trained doctors. They were women who had performed this job many times and were trusted to report honestly to the king. The idea that a woman's honor could be confirmed by someone's fingers is one of the strangest things ever accepted as tradition. These women would check for the presence of the hymen, believing that it was the only sign of virginity. They didn't consider that some girls were born without one, or that it could break for many innocent reasons. No, they were told to find it, and if they couldn't, the girl was considered impure. The report would then go to the king, the groom's family, and in some cases, even the church. If the inspection passed, the wedding continued. The girl was seen as worthy of marriage, but if there was doubt, everything changed. A failed inspection could mean being sent away to a convent or banished from court. In more severe cases, especially if the royal family felt shamed in front of their allies, the punishment could be death. There are stories of princesses being poisoned or quietly executed because they were believed to have lost their virginity before marriage. Sometimes the accusation wasn't even true. Some families repeated the inspection more than once, using different women to check, hoping for a different result. Others forced the girl to swear on a holy book that she had never been touched. But even if she swore, it didn't always matter. Compared to modern standards, this would be like forcing a young bride to undergo a public body scan before walking down the aisle. To prepare for the inspection, many girls were kept away from men for years. Some were locked in towers or guarded by women day and night. Every male servant was removed from the area. The fear of losing the royal honor was stronger than any sense of comfort or trust. Parents believed that a daughter's body carried the reputation of the whole family, and so they controlled it as if it were property. In some courts, the inspections became ceremonies. Women from noble families were invited to watch. They would gather in a chamber dressed in their finest clothes and wait for the moment when the girl was brought in. She would be asked to lie down on a bench or stand on a stool, depending on local custom. Then the royal examiner would begin her work while others observed in silence. The girl was not allowed to cover her face. Her expression was part of the judgment. What troubles me most is how no one seemed to care about what these girls felt. After the inspection, the results were often announced immediately. If she passed, she might be hugged and congratulated. If she failed, she was removed quietly, and the guests would be told that the wedding was delayed. Rumors would spread in the court. Servants would whisper, and the girl would never return to public life in the same way again. Some girls tried to fake their virginity by bleeding during the wedding night, using small animal bladders or bits of sponge soaked in blood. Others would ask servants to help them insert thin membranes made from pigskin to mimic the hymen. But these tricks were risky. If caught, they faced worse punishment. And even if they weren't caught, the guilt often stayed with them for life. The women who performed these inspections rarely questioned what they were doing. They had been raised in the system. They were told it was their duty. Some felt pity, others did not. They focused on the task and avoided looking into the girl's eyes. It was easier that way. When the inspection was over and the room was cleared, the girl would often sit alone for hours trying to understand what had just happened. She might still get married. She might be sent away. But either way, something inside her had changed. Not just her body, but her trust in the people who were supposed to protect her. No matter how well a girl behaved or how much she followed the rules, one false move or one mistaken inspection could destroy everything. As the palace servants cleared the room and the candles burned low, another girl somewhere else in the kingdom might be preparing for her own inspection. She would be told it was tradition, that it was important, that it had always been done. But she would know deep down that none of it was really for her. In the next part, we will look at the marriages between close relatives inside royal families and how incest was seen as a way to protect the bloodline, even when it caused more harm than good. The fear of losing a throne was stronger than most emotions in medieval royal families. A king might trust his soldiers, his ministers, or even his sons. But when it came to the bloodline, he trusted only one thing: family. To keep the royal blood pure, many kingdoms arranged marriages between close relatives. Cousins, half-siblings, even uncles and nieces were matched. Not out of love or personal connection, but out of duty to the throne. The goal was always the same: make sure the crown stayed in the hands of someone with the right last name. In some royal families, it was common for cousins to marry each other. These marriages were often planned from the time the children were born. If a king had a daughter and his brother had a son, they would agree that one day the two children would marry. It didn't matter that they were related. It was seen as an advantage. The families were already connected, so there would be no fighting over power. Everything stayed in the same hands. The idea was that blood was stronger than anything else. Bringing in someone from another family, even a noble one, was seen as a risk. That new person might want to claim land, titles, or influence. By marrying inside the family, the royals thought they could avoid all of that. They believed it was safer to share a bed with a cousin than a throne with a stranger. It's strange how the people who feared outsiders the most were often sleeping with their relatives. These cousin marriages were not always between adults. Some were arranged between children, sometimes before they could even walk. Two toddlers from the same royal line would be betrothed with a ceremony, and everyone would smile as if it were a happy moment. When they got older, they had no choice but to follow through. Some were married by the age of 12 or 13. A few were forced into their roles, even younger. There are records of royal families pushing even further. In some cases, kings were accused of having children with their daughters. It was not always proven, but the rumors were strong enough that they appeared in documents and stories of the time. One king was said to have taken his daughter as his second wife after the queen died. Another was rumored to have fathered children with multiple half-siblings. The court would stay quiet, but everyone knew. Servants, scribes, and guards all saw things they were never allowed to repeat when questioned. These families often gave the same answer. They said it was necessary to keep the line pure. They believed that if royal blood mixed with common blood, the kingdom would suffer. They feared curses, illness, and rebellion. But by keeping the blood within the same family, they thought they could stay close to the gods, or at least close to power. Of course, the results were not always good. These marriages between close relatives often led to health problems. Children were born with weak bones, poor eyesight, or mental disabilities. Some never lived past infancy. Others became kings or queens, but struggled to rule because of constant sickness. In today's world, we call that inbreeding and know it causes long-term harm. Back then, they called it tradition. The children in these families didn't have a say. A prince might grow up knowing he would marry his cousin. A princess might be told that her half-brother was going to be her husband. Some were confused, others afraid, but none of them were allowed to refuse. If they protested, they were told they were disloyal to the family. If they cried, they were told to grow up. There were also political reasons for these pairings. In some kingdoms, the rules stated that only those of royal blood could inherit the throne. If no eligible candidate could be found outside the family, the court would look inside. Marrying a niece or cousin became the only way to keep the crown safe. Even when a suitable outsider existed, they were often ignored in favor of someone with a closer bloodline. Some historians believe that these unions were more about control than love or purity. By marrying within the family, a king could keep his children close and his enemies far. He didn't have to worry about rival families growing too powerful. He didn't have to divide land or share secrets. Everything stayed within the same walls. What stands out most to me is how the children became tools arranged like pieces on a chessboard without ever being asked what they wanted. As generations passed, the effects of this system became clear. Royal portraits began to show faces with the same features repeated too often. The family trees became twisted and confusing. Some kings had more titles than sense. Some queens married men who had once been raised as their brothers. The lines between parents, sibling, and spouse blurred until no one outside the palace could tell who was related to whom. Even worse, some of these marriages were not just close in blood, but close in age and location. A girl raised beside her cousin was later told to share his bed. A boy who had played games with his aunt's daughter was forced to call her wife. The emotional confusion was deep. They were told it was normal. They were told it was for the kingdom. But inside, many of them carried the weight of knowing something wasn't right. At court banquets and ceremonies, these couples smiled and played their roles. Behind the walls, they often lived separate lives. Some barely spoke to each other outside of required appearances. Others were deeply unhappy. A few tried to escape the system, but most accepted their fate. It was what they were born into. It was what was expected. As the firelight flickered across painted ceilings and quiet halls, another royal child might be sitting in her chamber holding a wedding dress that had been sewn for her since birth. She would not know what love meant. She would only know duty. In the next part, we'll explore what happened when death entered the picture and how some kings believed that a queen's body could still serve a purpose even after she stopped breathing. Some royal customs were created to protect power, others to keep bloodlines pure, but a few crossed into something even darker. In certain kingdoms, when a queen died, her body was not taken straight to the tomb. It was kept inside the palace for days, not just for mourning, but for something far more disturbing. Some kings believed that death did not end their bond with the queen, especially when it came to the marriage bed. These kings wanted to lie one last time with the body of their dead wife. Not symbolically, but physically. They saw it as a farewell act, a final confirmation that she still belonged to them even after her last breath. Some called it a ritual. Others called it madness. But it happened often enough to be written in court records and whispered among servants. The body would be placed in a special room separate from the main halls. The windows were closed and the doors were guarded. Only a few people were allowed inside. The queen's body was dressed in fine clothes and perfumes were used to mask the early signs of decay. Sometimes her hair was combed and decorated with pins and jewels. The idea was to make her look as close to life as possible, even though everyone knew she was already gone. It's hard to imagine a more twisted version of a goodbye than a king crawling into bed with his dead queen. The king would enter the room alone. No one was supposed to know what happened after the door shut, but many guessed. In some cases, the servants were ordered to prepare oils, cloths, and even clean sheets. These were not needed for mourning. They were meant for something else. When the king came out, no one asked questions. He would walk down the hallway, silent and pale, while the guards quietly opened the doors for fresh air to return. The body was usually kept for 3 or 4 days before burial. During that time, the king could return to the room more than once. He might sit beside her, speak to her, or lie beside her again. It was all treated as part of a farewell ritual. No priest would interfere. No court advisor would object. The pain of the king was seen as sacred, and anything he did in private was accepted. Some kings even gave instructions to delay burial if they felt the ritual was not complete. They would say the queen needed more time for her soul to find peace. But the real reason was known to those closest to the royal chambers. The queen was not allowed to leave until the king said so, even in death. Not every king behaved this way, but the ones who did left behind enough stories for future generations to record. One king in Eastern Europe was known for keeping his wife's body in bed with him for a full week. He refused to let anyone enter the room. The smell eventually became too strong to hide, and only then did he allow the funeral to begin. Another king had a private room built under his palace just for the purpose of keeping his wife's bodies after death. It was described in old documents as a place of memory, but many believed it was something else entirely. There were even rumors that one of his wives died during childbirth, and he spent 3 nights beside her cold body, calling it a holy act. If this happened today, the palace would be surrounded by police and forensic teams. Back then, it was just another chapter in the royal story. In many ways, these acts came from the same place as the rules about bloodline and marriage. The king believed that his wife belonged to him completely in life, in death, and even beyond. Her body was still seen as his property, and no one had the courage to tell him otherwise. The servants obeyed. The priests stayed quiet. The family looked away. Some records from palace scribes describe the events in careful, polite words. They use phrases like ritual closure or final union. But the meaning is clear. A man unwilling to let go turned his wife's corpse into something that served his desires. Whether it was out of grief, madness, or a sense of power, no one could say for sure. But it was accepted, and that's what makes it so disturbing. There were also beliefs at the time that this final act could help the queen's soul cross into the next life. By lying with her one last time, the king was said to seal her passage. It was meant to bring peace both to her and to him. But peace does not usually involve locking a room and keeping a corpse dressed in lace and pearls. What bothers me most is not just what the king did, but how everyone else allowed it to happen. In some cases, the queen's body was not even buried after the ritual. It was placed in a sealed tomb inside the palace. The king would visit it from time to time, leaving behind gifts or speaking to the stone. Some said he still believed she could hear him. Others thought he was waiting for death to join her and repeat the act again. Not all queens were treated this way. Some were buried quickly with a proper ceremony. But when a king chose the other path, no one dared to stop him. Power made everything acceptable. Even love turned into something cold and forced. As the candles melted down in the sealed room and the walls held in the silence, another royal woman somewhere in the kingdom might have heard the story and wondered what would happen to her one day. Would she be remembered with prayers and flowers, or with locked doors and strange rituals? In the next part, we'll look at how sex became part of royal religious offerings, and how kings and queens were expected to perform intimate acts as part of public sacrifices to the gods. Not all royal sexual rituals happened in secret chambers. Some took place in front of others during events that were meant to look like religious ceremonies. In a few medieval courts, there was a belief that fertility and royal power came from the gods. And to keep that connection strong, physical acts had to be offered back to those same gods. This led to rituals that combined sex and worship carried out by people from the royal family on important days of the year in certain palaces. Holy festivals were marked with what they called a sacred union. The belief was that the land, the crops, and the people's health depended on the king's ability to connect with divine forces. To do that, he had to perform what they called symbolic intercourse, often in front of an audience of nobles, priests, and trusted palace staff. The woman chosen to participate was usually of royal blood, too. Sometimes she was the queen, other times a high-ranking noblewoman, and occasionally a young relative selected just for that purpose. The act was seen as more than physical. It was supposed to show the gods that the king was willing to give a part of himself in return for blessings. The woman was considered a stand-in for the goddess of fertility. The idea was that by uniting their bodies, they were copying what the gods had done in the sky. But it was not just a performance. Many of these rituals were real, physical, and sometimes even repeated each year. It's hard to believe people once clapped for sex as if it were a rain dance. The location was usually inside a private temple within the palace walls. The room would be prepared days in advance. Flowers were hung from the ceiling. Fresh linens were placed on the altar or the ritual bed. Scented smoke filled the space, and priests stood by to chant prayers. The king would arrive wearing ceremonial clothes, often bare-chested or wrapped in thin robes. The woman would be dressed in white or gold, depending on the season. As part of the ritual, the couple would lie together while the priests continued chanting. No one spoke. No one moved unless they were told. In some versions of the ceremony, the priest would collect the king's semen afterward using a cloth or a special cup. It would then be placed on the altar or sprinkled onto sacred objects. This was supposed to bring divine energy into the temple and protect the kingdom for another year. Some palaces even had permanent staff assigned to these tasks. There were servants who cleaned the ritual room, prepared the oils, and managed the clothes used in the ceremony. They were trained to remain silent and not make eye contact. Everyone involved knew their role, and the line between worship and obedience became very thin. If someone tried to film a religious sex scene in a modern church, the entire country would protest. But back then, it was just another royal duty. The woman who took part was not always given a choice. Even if she was royal, refusing to participate could be seen as an insult to the gods. Some queens accepted the role because they wanted to appear strong and devoted. Others went along with it because they were afraid. In rare cases, the same woman was used for several years in a row, becoming known in the palace as the fertility vessel, though no one dared say it out loud. The king was praised afterward. He was seen as powerful, generous, and spiritually strong. People believed that the more committed he was during the ritual, the better the harvest would be. Some kings took pride in this role and even invited foreign guests to witness parts of the ceremony, especially during alliances or treaty signings. It was a strange form of diplomacy, but one that was taken seriously at the time. There were also cases where the ritual wasn't limited to one couple. On certain holidays, multiple pairs were chosen, including nobles, priests, and even guards. They were matched based on rank and bloodline, and their unions were meant to mimic the structure of divine relationships. Everything was controlled. Who participated, when it happened, and how the seed was handled afterward. None of it was accidental. The strangest part for me is how ordinary people believe their fate depended on whether a king reached climax during a temple ritual. Written records from these courts describe the process in great detail. They list the names of participants, the chants used, and even the exact timing of each step. Some kings had personal scribes who kept notes during the ceremony, later turning them into official archives. These documents still exist in fragments found in monasteries or buried beneath old palaces. Over time, some of these rituals were replaced by more symbolic acts. The couple might lie together under a blanket without touching, or the king would pour water onto the altar instead of offering semen. But in the earlier centuries, the physical act was real and it carried heavy meaning. It was not about love. It was not even about pleasure. It was about showing the gods that the king was worthy of their favor. The servants who cleaned the ritual room after the event rarely spoke of what they saw. They knew better. Some burned the sheets. Others buried the cloth in temple gardens. It depended on local beliefs, but the goal was always the same. Transfer the king's energy to the earth through the gods, using sex as the bridge. Not all kingdoms practiced these rituals. Some saw them as sinful and banned them. But in places where the old traditions were strong, they lasted for centuries. They became part of the rhythm of royal life. The harvest meant a ritual. The new moon meant preparation. The king's body was not just his own. It was a tool for divine connection. As the chants faded and the smoke cleared, another servant might enter the room to collect what was left. She would move carefully, not out of respect, but because she had been trained that way. The room was holy, even if what happened inside felt anything but. In the next part, we'll turn to a very different kind of belief. One where royal women used their menstrual blood to try to control love and power, mixing old magic with personal desperation. Royal rituals were not always grand events filled with music and ceremony. Some were quiet, secret, and done by women behind closed doors. In many medieval courts, noble women believed that their blood had power. Not the kind spilled in battle, but the kind that came every month. Menstrual blood to them was more than a physical sign. It was seen as a tool. And in certain circles, it was used as a weapon to capture love and bind loyalty. Among noble and royal women, there was a belief that a man could be made to fall in love or stay in love if he unknowingly consumed a drop of a woman's menstrual blood. The idea was that this blood held her essence. By swallowing it, the man would be tied to her. His desires would be harder to control. His thoughts would return to her more often. It wasn't just about romance. It was about control. The method was simple. The blood was usually mixed into food or drink. A woman might hide it in a thick stew, stir it into dark wine, or smear it on a piece of cooked meat. The trick was to make sure it didn't stand out. Once the man ate it, she would watch closely, waiting to see changes in his behavior. If he returned to her chamber more often or spoke more kindly, she believed it had worked. It's funny in a grim way. While kings were sprinkling semen on altars, queens were stirring blood into soup. This belief wasn't just something peasants whispered about. It reached high into the ranks of royalty. Some queens, desperate to keep the attention of a wandering husband, were said to have used their blood in his meals. A few even involved servants asking them to help prepare the dish in just the right way. The risk was high. If discovered, the punishment could be severe. But many believed it was worth trying, especially in a palace where affection often faded quickly. In some cases, the blood wasn't fed to a man, but placed directly onto sacred objects. There are stories of royal women smearing their menstrual blood onto statues of saints, crosses, or religious relics. They thought this would turn the divine gaze toward their personal wishes. Instead of praying with words, they left a physical trace of their body behind. The act was hidden, done at night or in private chapels. A few of these events were recorded, not because they succeeded, but because they were discovered. One queen was caught wiping blood onto a wooden crucifix. The priest who found it reported her to the court, and she was accused of blasphemy. In another court, a noble woman was said to have soaked a strip of cloth in her blood and tucked it into the bedding of a man she hoped to marry. When it was found, she claimed it was an accident, but few believed her. Despite the risks, the belief didn't disappear. It was passed down from older women to younger ones. A mother might whisper it to her daughter before marriage. A midwife might mention it during childbirth. It became part of the hidden knowledge that women shared when no one else was listening. If a modern woman admitted to doing this, she'd probably end up in the news or a courtroom. But for many medieval noblewomen, it was just another recipe for survival. Not all attempts were done out of love. Some women used it to get revenge. If a man had betrayed them or insulted their family, slipping blood into his meal was a way to gain the upper hand. They believed it would make him weak, confused or unable to love anyone else, whether or not it truly worked. The belief gave these women a sense of power in a world that offered them very little control. The church strongly opposed these actions. Clergy called it witchcraft. They said menstrual blood was unclean and should never touch anything holy. But the more they spoke against it, the more it happened in secret. Royal women learned to be careful. They kept their clothes hidden. They burned stained sheets. They trained servants to keep quiet. The ritual became more about secrecy than spirituality. Some scholars today believe the whole idea was symbolic. The blood represented life, fertility, and inner strength. By offering it in such a personal way, women were claiming a form of influence that men could not take from them. But in the medieval world, it was never explained like that. It was just something that was done, believed, and passed on. What strikes me is how even queens, who seemed to have everything still, felt the need to hide blood and food just to hold on to someone. There are no statues or paintings that show this practice. It wasn't something people wanted remembered, but the story survived through letters, rumors, and confessions made under pressure. In palace kitchens and bedchambers, the quiet work of mixing blood and love continued long after the priests gave their warnings. Even today, fragments of these beliefs remain in old folk tales and family legends. Some describe women putting drops of blood into wine glasses. Others say a shirt stained with menstrual blood was worn by a husband who never strayed again. These stories aren't taught in school, but they linger in corners of history as candles burned low in private dining halls and prayers echoed from distant chapels. Another noblewoman might be tucking away a handkerchief, waiting for the right time to use it. She wasn't thinking about sin or shame. She was thinking about keeping what little power she had. In the next part, we'll examine how royal men were allowed to masturbate in front of altars and courtiers, not in secret shame, but as part of a strange ritual meant to show strength and fertility. Royal rituals didn't always happen behind closed doors in some medieval courts. Acts that most people today would consider private were done openly in the name of strength, purity, and divine favor. One of the strangest practices was the public masturbation of kings and princes. It wasn't treated as sinful or shameful. It was described as a rite of purification or sometimes even as a form of offering. These acts often took place in temples or palace shrines, not hidden, but with full permission and participation from others in the court. The belief was that semen like blood carried power. When a king stood before a statue of a god and pleasured himself, it was supposed to be a way to show the gods that he was still strong, fertile, and fit to rule. It was not about desire, it was about display. His climax was seen as a symbol of abundance. Just as land had to be fertile, so did the king. If he could release his seed in the presence of the gods, the people believed the harvest would be good and the kingdom would remain stable. These rituals usually took place at the start of a new season, during an eclipse, or after a long illness. Sometimes the king did it alone, with only a priest watching. Other times it was done in front of the full court. The king would stand on a raised platform, often in front of a statue of a male deity, and perform the act slowly and deliberately. There was no laughter, no discomfort. Everyone was told to remain still and respectful. It's hard to say what's more awkward, watching your king touch himself, or pretending it's completely normal. This wasn't just done once or twice in history. Some royal courts had it written into their seasonal calendars. The act was called a rite of renewal or cleansing, depending on the kingdom. It was also believed that the king's semen could be used afterward to help others. In one case, a priest collected it in a cloth and rubbed it on a statue of the goddess of fertility. In another, it was mixed with oil and applied to a sick queen's forehead as a supposed cure. There is even a story in one court where a group of royal physicians requested that the king donate his semen regularly to be stored in jars. These jars were then kept in a cool chamber, labeled carefully, and only used when the royal family faced health problems. The idea was that royal fluid, like holy water, could protect and heal. It was not seen as strange, it was simply part of royal life. Some princes were expected to do the same when they reached a certain age. Their first public release was treated like a rite of passage. Fathers watched, ministers watched, and afterward the boy was blessed and given gifts. It was believed that if a prince could not perform this task, he was not ready to lead. Some failed and were shamed. Others succeeded and their names were celebrated in quiet ceremonies. This act was also used as a test during negotiations. In rare cases, a visiting prince or nobleman was asked to prove his strength in the same way as a gesture of alliance. If he agreed, it meant he trusted the kingdom and honored its gods. If he refused, the court considered it a sign of weakness or offense. If any modern politician tried this during a press conference, they'd be escorted away in seconds. But in some medieval palaces, it earned applause. There are records of nobles standing in silence while the king completed the ritual, then bowing afterward. No one was allowed to speak during the act. Any noise could be punished. The walls of the temple were decorated with carvings of fertility symbols, and soft music played from the far side of the room. Some kings insisted that their act take place at sunrise, with light shining directly onto the statue in front of them. The idea behind all of this was simple. If the gods had given the king his strength, then he had to give some of it back. That meant offering what was seen as his most sacred fluid. To them, semen was not something to hide. It was a part of royal duty, and if the king refused, it was said that the land would dry, the people would grow sick, and war would come to the gates. A few court scribes described the ritual in detail. One wrote about the scent of the room, the silence of the court, and the exact moment when the king's hand paused before finishing. Another described how the statue was washed afterward with wine and cloth. These records were kept hidden, read only by future kings or temple caretakers. But they show how serious the practice was and how far people were willing to go to keep the system in place. Not everyone believed in it, Some clergy spoke out, calling it prideful or corrupt, but they were quickly silenced. In many palaces, the king's body was treated as holy, and what he chose to do with it was above question. The servants cleaned up, the priests gave their blessings, and the people outside the palace never knew. What I find most unsettling is how something so private became a tool for proving worth, not just to the gods, but to an entire court. After the ritual ended, the room would be cleaned thoroughly. New sheets laid down, oils and incense burned for hours. The jars of collected semen were sealed and stored carefully. They were labeled with the king's name, the date, and the purpose of use. Some were never touched again. Others were used in strange ways that no one fully recorded. As the sunlight faded through colored glass and the guards returned to their stations, another prince might be summoned quietly for his first test. He wouldn't be asked how he felt. He would only be told what to do and when. In the next part, we'll explore the secret rooms behind royal banquets, where group sex between royals, nobles, and slaves became a way to celebrate power, not pleasure. Not all royal ceremonies were held in daylight. Some took place at night, far from the public eye. After the last wine cups were emptied and the last songs faded from the halls. In certain royal courts, the real celebration began only after the guests thought the party was over. Behind hidden doors and under heavy curtains, group sex became a regular part of private banquets. It was not treated as scandalous. It was organized, expected, and for some, even required. These secret rooms were part of the palace architecture. They were built beside banquet halls or underneath garden courtyards. After hours of drinking, eating, and toasting, the king or a high-ranking noble would give a quiet signal. Servants would then lead selected guests down narrow hallways to these rooms. Inside, the atmosphere was very different. Low lighting, piles of cushions, warm perfumes, and unclothed bodies moving slowly across the space. The room smelled of oil, sweat, and smoke. Nothing about it was accidental. The men and women waiting inside were not fellow guests. They were slaves, hand-picked by the royal household. Some were young, some were older. All were chosen based on the known preferences of the nobles expected to attend. There were people assigned just to gather this information. Which lord preferred red hair? Which prince liked tall men? Which queen desired soft skin or strong hands? This was known and carefully managed is almost impressive in the worst way possible. How much planning went into making orgies feel like royal protocol. Once inside, the rules were few. Those who wanted to participate did. Those who didn't could watch or leave quietly, but most stayed. They believed it was part of court culture. Refusing would offend the king or show disloyalty. Some joined because they were curious. Others joined because they were drunk. And a few joined because they had no choice. The line between pleasure and power was never clear. The slaves, on the other hand, never had a choice. They were told where to stand, how to act, and who to please. If they failed to satisfy a guest, they could be punished later. Some were trained from a young age to perform in these settings. They were cleaned, perfumed, and dressed in thin fabric that could be removed easily. Some were decorated with rings, chains, or painted skin. Their role was simple: serve without question. There are records describing these rooms in detail. One account talks about silk-covered beds arranged in a circle. Another describes benches with carved handles placed at different heights. Wine was poured constantly. Music played softly in the background, and guards stood at the door to make sure no one entered without permission. Some nights, the gathering stayed small, limited to a few trusted guests. Other times it expanded into a full court ritual. Everyone who held power participated. There are mentions of kings watching from raised platforms, while others engaged below. In some cases, the king joined in. In others, he simply chose who would go with whom. It was treated like a theater, except the actors were real and no one was pretending. Imagine your boss inviting you to an after-party and then pointing to a stranger, expecting you to strip down and smile. That's the level of absurdity we're dealing with here. One of the most disturbing parts is how princesses were sometimes included. Not always directly, but enough to be noted in historical accounts. There's a story from a northern kingdom where two royal daughters were brought into one of these rooms by the order of their uncle. They were told it was a ceremony of maturity. The next morning, they were sent to convents, their names removed from all official documents. The event was recorded later by a court scribe who called it the night that dirtied the crown. These events weren't secret to everyone. Palace staff knew. Servants who cleaned the rooms found evidence the next day: stained cloths, broken jewelry, spilled wine, and in some cases, blood. Some tried to warn others. A few wrote letters that were never sent, but most stayed silent. Speaking out meant losing their position or worse. Some queens were involved too, not just as observers, but as participants. They were expected to show that they were open-minded, worldly, and aligned with the king's desires. Some enjoyed the freedom these nights gave them. Others hated every moment and later wrote about it in private journals, many of which were destroyed or hidden for centuries. What stays with me is the silence that followed these nights. The way the palace returned to normal as if nothing had happened. By sunrise, the cushions were collected, the floor swept, and the doors locked again. At breakfast, no one spoke of what had taken place. They returned to their formal clothes and practiced smiles, but underneath, the memory lingered. For some, it was a badge of belonging. For others, a scar. These group encounters weren't just about desire. They were used to build alliances, reward loyalty, and sometimes test obedience. A noble who performed well might be given land or favor. A guest who hesitates might be cut from the following invitation. Participation became a way to stay close to power. And in medieval courts, closeness to power meant survival. These gatherings faded in some kingdoms as new rulers took the throne and the church gained more influence. But for centuries, they were as much a part of palace life as coronations or royal weddings. They were never mentioned in official records, but they shaped reputations, destroyed some lives, and built others. As torches dimmed and curtains were drawn tight, another group might be forming in the hallway. Another slave brushed with oil, another guest handed a goblet, another night beginning with laughter and ending in silence. In the next part, we'll look at how royal men were allowed to force themselves on chosen women in the name of transferring strength, and how those women were punished if they dared resist, behind the stone walls of medieval palaces. Not every royal act was dressed in silk or cloaked in ritual. Some were brutal, simple, and done in the name of something called strength. In certain kingdoms, kings believed they could pass on their power through sex. It was called transferring vitality, or giving the seed of strength. But it wasn't a gift. It was an order, and the women involved were rarely asked what they thought. The belief was rooted in the idea that a strong ruler could create strong heirs, not just through blood, but through energy. To pass that energy forward, The king had to choose a woman and lie with her at the right time, usually after a military victory, a coronation, or a religious feast. The chosen woman was expected to receive this honor in silence. She did not ask why. She did not refuse, because refusing meant punishment, and punishment could mean exile or worse. Most of the women chosen for this so-called blessing were slaves or low-ranking servants. Their bodies were considered available. Some were selected based on appearance. Others were picked at random. Once chosen, they were bathed, dressed in clean linen, and brought into the king's private room. Sometimes they were blindfolded. Other times they were forced to kneel. No one explained the ritual. It was not about ceremony. It was about control. Calling forced sex a blessing doesn't make it any less violent. It just makes the people saying it sound ridiculous. Once the act was done, the woman was watched closely. If she became pregnant, the palace staff began a new phase of observation. She was given better food, softer bedding, and sometimes even a midwife to monitor her health. But this care had conditions. It was only valuable if she gave birth to a boy. A son meant success. A daughter meant failure, and failure came with a price. In some kingdoms, if a woman gave birth to a girl, she was quietly removed. Some were sent to nunneries, others disappeared without a trace. Some documents mentioned certain cleansings after royal rituals, terms that suggest forced abortions or executions. A few were allowed to live if the king took pity, but pity was rare in courts where bloodlines mattered more than lives. If the child was a boy, the woman was sometimes promised freedom, but even then it was not guaranteed. She might be sent away with the child or kept locked in a small wing of the palace when no one saw her again. The boy, if healthy, would be raised by other women, never knowing his mother. She had done her part. Her value had expired. What makes this practice worse is that no one inside the court questioned it. The king had the right to choose. The woman had no right to object. Even if she cried, begged, or resisted, her voice was ignored. The court called it tradition. The priest called it necessary. The scribes called it a form of sacred duty. But for the women, it was something else entirely. If this were written into a royal law today, the outcry would shut down an entire government. In medieval courts, it earned applause. There are accounts of kings bragging about how many children they had fathered through this ritual. Some claimed they had spread strong blood across villages. Others insisted they had healed the land through these acts. No one stopped to ask what the women thought. Their names weren't recorded. Their pain wasn't written down. They were just numbers in someone else's story. The servants who prepared the women often stayed silent. A few left clues in their personal letters describing the fear in the girls' eyes or the shaking in their hands. But those letters rarely made it outside the palace. Talking about the ritual was dangerous, and no one wanted to risk being chosen next. Some queens knew what was happening. A few supported it, believing it helped keep the king focused. Others hated it, but had no power to stop it. In one court, a queen was said to have ordered her ladies-in-waiting to block the doors during one such ritual. She was later punished, stripped of her title, and sent away. After that, the palace made sure the doors stayed open. What disturbs me most is how these women were seen as tools used once and then discarded while everyone around acted like it was normal. The idea of passing strength through sex didn't stay in one kingdom. It moved between courts, adapted to local customs. Some called it the seed ritual. Others named it the blessing of the throne, but the core idea was always the same. The king had power, and women were just containers for that power to move forward. Not all women became pregnant. Some were blamed for this and punished again, as if it were their fault the ritual didn't work. In a few courts, herbs were forced into their mouths to cleanse their bodies after failure. These herbs caused vomiting, bleeding, and sometimes death. The ritual had failed, and so had they. The rooms where these acts took place were usually small, plain, and locked tight. A few had carved walls showing scenes of animals mating, as if to justify what was happening inside. The bedding was replaced each time. The sheets burned or buried. No one spoke of the room, but everyone knew where it was. As night settled across the courtyard, and the torches flickered in their brackets, another girl might be walking down a quiet hallway, unaware that her name had just been chosen. Her body would be prepared, her door would be unlocked, and her voice, if she had one, would not be heard. In the next part, we'll see how the idea of sexual energy spread even further, with some royal women ordered to lie with soldiers, not out of desire, but to absorb what was seen as masculine strength from the lower classes. Not all sexual rituals in royal courts were about kings proving strength or spreading bloodlines. Some involved queens. In a few kingdoms, there was a belief that royal women, especially queens or high priestesses, needed to balance their energy with that of the common people. The idea came from old spiritual teachings that said a woman's power could become stagnant if it stayed inside palace walls too long. To prevent that, she needed to absorb new energy, and the way to do that was through sex with someone far outside her rank. This was not done in secret or treated as a scandal. It was part of a carefully managed ritual. The queen would choose or be assigned a palace guard, someone young, healthy, and unknown to her. He would be brought into a special chamber, usually once a month, during a set phase of the moon. Before entering, he would be bathed, perfumed, and then blindfolded. The blindfold wasn't just for privacy. It was meant to ensure that the man could never claim to have seen the queen's face, even by accident. The room was quiet, dimly lit, and lined with thick fabric. The guard was expected to remain silent and follow instructions. The queen, or sometimes a female attendant acting in her place, would initiate the act. No words were exchanged, no names spoken. When it was over, the guard was taken out through a side door, dressed, and returned to his barracks. He was not allowed to speak of what had happened. In many cases, he was sent away the next day to serve at a distant outpost. It says something strange about a system when the most intimate act between two people feels more like a scheduled delivery than a shared experience. The belief behind this practice was based on the idea of yin and yang, or in some cases, sun and earth. The queen, surrounded by noblemen, priests, and women of high birth, was seen as too full of refined energy. To remain grounded and fertile, she needed raw earthly force, something that only a man from the lower classes could provide. A soldier with his sweat, strength, and bloodied boots represented that force. Some believed this ritual helped queens conceive. Others thought it kept them healthy. A few saw it as a way to calm their minds. But whatever the reason, the outcome was the same. One man entered the room blindfolded, one woman received him, and no one spoke afterward. The next day, life resumed as if it hadn't happened. The guards selected for this role were chosen carefully. They were not informed ahead of time. A commander or priest would call them aside, give basic instructions, and escort them to the chamber. Some were terrified, others took it as an honor, but none were allowed to repeat the experience. Once a man had been used in this way, he was considered spent. The court did not allow repeats. fearing emotional attachment or gossip. There were rules to ensure silence. Some guards were promised gold, others were sworn to secrecy through threats. A few were never seen again in the palace. They were reassigned to faraway posts, sometimes in dangerous places. Their names were quietly removed from court records. Over time, even their families stopped hearing from them. If this happened in a modern office, it would be called misconduct, followed by lawsuits. In the palace, it was considered balanced. The Queen's attendants handled the details. They selected the day, prepared the room, and confirmed the guard's condition. Sometimes, if the Queen was ill or unavailable, a surrogate woman of similar age and build was used instead. The energy transfer was considered more important than the identity of the people involved. It wasn't about love. It was about roles and rules. Some queens looked forward to the ritual. Others resented it, but all accepted it as part of their duty. Refusing meant questioning old beliefs, and in courts built on tradition, that was dangerous. A few queens tried to end the practice. One was said to have sent back 3 guards in a row without touching them. She later fell ill, and her advisors claimed it was punishment from the spirits. Palace records mentioned these rituals only in passing. They are listed as balancing sessions or night offerings. The details were known only to a few, but letters from servants and whispers in the kitchen filled in the blanks. People knew what was happening. They just didn't speak of it in public. What unsettles me is how quiet the palace stayed during these nights. How something so intense could be wrapped in routine. The room used for the ritual was cleaned immediately after. Bedding was burned or buried. Oils were refreshed. Some queens kept a cloth token from the act, a piece of fabric or a small charm. Others asked that nothing be saved. It depended on the woman and the court she served. There were stories, of course, rumors that some guards removed their blindfolds, that some queens requested the same man twice, that children were born from these encounters and raised in secret. But none of these stories were ever confirmed. In the palace, silence was stronger than truth. The guards never returned to that room. Some became legends among the lower soldiers. Others were forgotten, but they all carried something that no one else could prove. A memory blurred by darkness, fear, and the weight of something they weren't meant to understand. As the Queen returned to her daily life, blessing the sick, walking the gardens, listening to court musicians, another guard, somewhere in the palace, might be selected. He would not be told why, only where to go and what not to say. In the next part, we'll look at a darker corner of royal pleasure, where kings used the bodies of animals, not as symbols, but as tools for arousal and ritual. Royal chambers often held more than just beds and tapestries. Hidden behind curtains and inside wooden boxes were objects that no guest was meant to see. Some of them were shaped like animals. Others were made from parts of animals. They were not for decoration. In certain palaces, kings and queens used these tools to arouse themselves or each other. What began as symbols of strength or fertility turned into items for private pleasure, often in ways that most people today would find disturbing. There were reports of kings using feathers, hides, and even living creatures as part of their sexual routines. One king was known to keep a fan made from peacock feathers beside his bed, but it was not for cooling. He used the stiff ends to stroke his thighs and stomach before sleep, believing the peacock's beauty would pass into his body. Another kept strips of snakeskin which he would press against his chest or wrap around certain parts of his body. He said it helped keep his desire sharp. These items were chosen carefully, They were not random. The peacock symbolized pride and virility. The snake stood for temptation and regeneration. To the king, using them wasn't strange. It was part of a ritual. A servant would bring the items each night and then leave the room. What happened next stayed behind closed doors, but traces of the practice survived in letters, old journals, and quiet testimonies from former palace workers. There's something oddly tragic about a man who rules a kingdom but still needs a bird feather to feel alive. Queens had their versions of these rituals. In some courts, rumors spread that small animals were used to arouse the queen or soothe her nerves. Tiny mammals like hairless ferrets or trained rodents were said to be washed, oiled, and released under her skirts. No one ever confirmed these stories officially, but drawings found in the margins of medical texts hinted at such practices. A few servants claimed to have prepared the animals themselves, though their accounts were vague and full of fear. These animals were not harmed, at least not at first. They were trained to stay calm and move slowly. Their bodies were rubbed with oils mixed with herbs. Some queens believed the sensation helped relieve pain or ease tension during long ceremonies or when sleep would not come. The court called it a healing technique, but many believed it was something else. In addition to living creatures, royal bedrooms also contained objects carved from animal parts. Some of these items were shaped like male or female genitals. They were made from smooth bone, ivory, or even horn. A few were decorated with gold or wrapped in leather. They were stored in locked chests or hidden under mattresses. These were not toys. They were treated as personal instruments, often passed from one generation to the next. Some kings believed that using these objects brought them closer to nature. Others simply enjoyed the feeling. The materials were cool, heavy, and held up over time. A piece made from the leg bone of a deer or the rib of a boar could last for years. Some were shaped by palace craftsmen. Others were ordered from distant regions where certain animals were considered more potent. If today's royals had drawers full of sex tools made from elk ribs, I'm pretty sure the press wouldn't let them forget it. These items were sometimes used during rituals, especially when the king or queen was ill or preparing for a religious holiday. They were said to cleanse the body, awaken desire, or help channel divine energy. But in most cases, they were simply used for private pleasure. The ritual was just an excuse to keep them in reach. The use of animals in this way was never discussed openly. It was passed down through trusted servants, midwives, and healers. A girl training to serve the queen might be shown how to clean a carved piece or oil a feather, but she would be told never to speak of it again. Boys who worked in the king's quarters learned which bones went where, and how to polish them until they shone like marble. These practices were not seen as wrong. They were just part of palace life. The idea of using living creatures or dead ones for sexual purposes did not cause the same reaction it would today. In fact, in some courts, it was considered a mark of refinement to have such items. Guests who were close to the royal family sometimes received smaller versions as gifts. Not all rulers followed these habits. Some thought it foolish, others found it offensive. But for those who did, it became routine. A feather here, a bone there, a creature trained to stay quiet. The chambers were full of candles, shadows, and silent tools. Nothing spoke, but everything was used. What I can't forget is how something so quiet, so strange, became ordinary behind those heavy palace doors. Over time, many of these items disappeared. Some were buried with their owners. Others were broken or burned during regime changes. A few ended up in private collections, misidentified as religious artifacts or medical tools. The stories about them became harder to prove, but they never fully disappeared. They remained in footnotes, family letters, and the memory of servants who dared to write the truth before they died. As the queen adjusted her robes, and the king finished his wine, another servant might be opening a chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were bones wrapped in linen, feathers tied with silk, and a tiny animal cage hidden under folded sheets. No one asked what they were for. Everyone already knew. In the next part, we'll step into an even more uncomfortable space, where statues shaped like genitals were not just decorations, but part of daily contact between royal women and sacred stone. Royal bedrooms were often filled with symbols. Some were for protection, some for luck, but others were much more specific. In certain medieval courts, there was a widespread belief that fertility could be summoned, not just through prayers or herbs, but through physical contact with sacred statues. These statues were not always of saints or gods. Many were shaped like male genitals, carved in stone and placed where royal women could see and touch them daily. The idea came from older traditions where phallic-shaped statues were seen as carriers of life. In temples and fields, people worshipped them to ask for children, good harvests, or strong animals. When those ideas entered royal courts, they didn't lose their shape. They simply changed location. Instead of sitting in public squares, these statues were moved into private chambers, especially into the rooms of princesses and queens who had not yet conceived. Young women of noble birth, especially those who are recently married, were encouraged to interact with these statues regularly. Some were told to kneel before them and place both hands on the stone. Others were instructed to lie beside them during rest. The most detailed accounts mention how a princess would be brought into a chamber before her wedding night, left alone with the statue, and told not to return until she had spent enough time connecting with it. If sex education today involved hugging marble genitals, I doubt many students would make it past the first lesson. The statues were carved from different materials depending on the region and wealth. Some were made of smooth white marble, others from black basalt or reddish sandstone. The shape was always exaggerated, larger than life, and often placed at waist height. Some had carvings of vines or animals running along the shaft, symbolizing growth and vitality. A few were painted or rubbed with oils to keep the surface soft and warm to the touch. It was not uncommon for a young princess to grow up with one of these objects in her room. She was told it was sacred, that it had been blessed by priests, and that it had helped her grandmother, her aunt, and her mother before her. She was taught to approach it with respect. Some days she would lay flowers at its base. Other times she would simply rest her forehead against it and whisper wishes she was not allowed to say aloud in court. The touching was considered harmless and holy, but it didn't stop there. In certain courts, women were encouraged to do more than just lay hands on the statue. They were told to simulate the act of union, fully clothed, but with intent. This was supposed to awaken their bodies, prepare their minds for childbirth, and please the spirits who watched over fertility. Servants were sent away during these moments, and the doors were locked until the bell rang for mealtime. Queens had similar practices. Some even kept their statues well into old age. There are records of one queen who refused to sleep unless her statue was nearby. She had it wrapped in red cloth and placed beside her pillow each night. Before bed, she would remove the cloth, kiss the statue gently, and hold it in her arms until she fell asleep. It was not considered strange. Her ladies-in-waiting were used to it. They cleaned the object like any other household item. There's something deeply surreal about tucking a stone phallus into bed next to a woman wearing a diamond crown. These statues were not hidden. In fact, in many noble households, they were displayed proudly. Guests might be led through halls lined with fertility figures, some holding wheat, others shaped like genitals. The meaning was clear. This was a house that honored life, growth, and the future. And no one was embarrassed. Religious figures sometimes objected. A few bishops wrote letters asking that the statues be removed or burned. They called them pagan, shameful, or sinful. But most rulers ignored these requests. They believed that the statues brought good fortune, and as long as children were being born, they saw no reason to change the tradition. The statues were sometimes included in childbirth rituals. A woman in labor might grip the statue during contractions. Others had it placed under the bed or at the foot of the delivery couch. It was seen as a guide, a protector, and a promise that the child would arrive safely. The midwives followed instructions carefully. They believed in the power of the object as much as the queen did. What I find most telling is how physical these traditions were. Faith wasn't just something you thought. It was something you touched, kissed, and carried into bed. Some statues were passed down from generation to generation. A new bride would receive the family statue as part of her wedding gifts. If it broke, it was considered a terrible omen. If a woman conceived soon after touching it, the statue might be decorated with ribbons or given a new pedestal in the bedroom. These objects were more than stone. They were witnesses to hundreds of nights, prayers, fears, and hopes. Not all women embraced the practice. Some felt uncomfortable and asked to have the statues removed. A few sent them to private storage or covered them with cloth when guests visited. But in most cases, the presence of the statue was seen as normal. Children grew up walking past them. Servants dusted them without comment. The royal sculptors even made new ones each year, using updated styles or smoother finishes. As candles flickered in the corners and the room grew quiet, a young noblewoman might reach out once more, pressing her hand to the cold surface, not out of passion, but out of habit. It was what her mother had done. It was what the court expected. And in her mind, it was part of becoming a wife. In the next part, we'll step into an even colder scene where royal men believed that sex on the edge of death could carry their souls into the next world, leading to disturbing acts with dying bodies. Death was never just the end in royal courts. For some kings, it was also a moment to prove one final thing. In certain kingdoms, there was a belief that a man needed to release his last desire before his soul could leave peacefully. Without that release, he might be stuck between worlds, unable to reach the afterlife. This belief led to a strange and deeply troubling practice. Some kings demanded sex in their final moments, and someone always had to provide it. The idea was simple. If the body still held desire at the time of death, the soul would be restless. So, the dying man had to be satisfied before his last breath. This meant that slaves, concubines, or even unwilling servants were forced to attend to him, even when he could no longer move or speak. In some cases, the king would give the order weeks before, telling his advisors which woman he wanted beside him when the time came. That woman was not allowed to leave the palace. She had to stay close, always ready. When death approached, the palace became quiet. Priests prayed. Healers prepared herbs. But somewhere in the back room, a young woman was being bathed and dressed. She knew what was expected. The king might be barely conscious. He might be feverish, bleeding, or paralyzed. None of that mattered. The belief said his seed had to be released no matter what. Only in a royal court could someone turn a deathbed into a stage for one last performance. These acts were treated as spiritual duties. The court did not call it abuse. They called them sacred. The woman's role was described as a final helper, someone who guided the king's body toward peace. No one asked what she wanted. Her comfort was not discussed. Even if the king could no longer respond, she was told to lie beside him, touch him, and wait for a sign. Some kings made special preparations. One ordered a platform to be built under his deathbed. The idea was that a concubine would lie beneath him, unseen by visitors, and act only when his breathing slowed. She was trained to respond in silence. Another ruler demanded that a girl be brought in wearing the same clothes as his first wife. He believed this would ease the transition and bring him joy in the afterlife. There are records of these rituals taking place with full court knowledge. Ministers waited outside. Guards stood watch. Priests offered their blessings. No one spoke against it. The belief in liberating the soul had been taught for generations. To deny the king this last act was seen as cruel, even dangerous. Some said it could bring bad luck on the kingdom if the ritual was not completed properly. Not all kings made this request, but enough did that the tradition became part of palace training. Girls selected for this role were often young and quiet. They were fed well, kept clean, and told they were lucky to serve the king in this way. Some were promised gold or freedom afterward. Few actually received it. Once the king died, the focus shifted to the funeral, and the girl's part in his death was forgotten. If hospitals today had staff assigned to pleasure patients before death, I doubt anyone would call it healthcare. Sometimes the ritual didn't work. The king died too quickly. The girl refused to participate. In those cases, the court would invent a story. They would say the act had been completed, even if it had not. They believed the lie was safer than admitting the king had passed without release. Better to fake peace than risk unrest. There were darker versions of the ritual, too. In one court, it was said that a dying prince demanded a young male servant instead of a woman. The servant was terrified but obeyed. After the act, he was given a cloak and told to leave the country. No one ever saw him again. Another story tells of a queen who was forced to receive her husband's final effort. Even though he had already lost the ability to speak, the priest guided his hand while the queen cried in silence. These stories are not easy to read, but they were real. They were written in old letters, whispered in kitchens, and scribbled into the margins of medical books. The belief that sex could unlock the soul's door was strong enough to shape how people lived and how they died. In these courts, the body never stopped being useful, even in its final minutes. What stays with me is how death, which should be quiet and dignified, became just another place where power demanded its due. The women involved were rarely honored. Most were dismissed quickly after the ritual. A few were sent to convents. Others were married off to guards or low-ranking nobles. The palace didn't want them around. Their presence was a reminder of what had happened, and the court preferred to forget. The rooms used for these acts were often sealed after the king's death. Some were turned into prayer spaces. Others were left untouched, as if freezing the moment in stone and silence. The beds were burned, the sheets are buried, but the stories lingered. Servants passed them down, and generations later they still reach us. Not everyone believed in the ritual. Some called it cruel. Others said it was a twisted excuse for control. But as long as the king believed it, no one could stop it. He was the center of the world, and if he said he needed to be touched before death, someone was forced to obey, as the final candle burned in the king's chamber, and the doors closed for the last time. A girl somewhere else in the palace might be sitting on a stool, hands folded, waiting to be told she could return home. She had done what was asked. She had no part in the funeral. In the next part, we'll look at how even royal children were drawn into these customs, not through participation, but through education, forced to watch acts they could not yet understand. In some medieval royal courts, sex was not only something that adults experienced, it was also something that children were expected to observe, especially boys. Young princes from a very early age were introduced to the adult world not through books or stories, but through direct exposure to what their fathers and mothers did behind closed doors. It was considered part of their royal education. These boys were often led into the royal bedchamber, usually by a trusted servant. The room would already be prepared. The king and queen would lie in bed, and the child was told to watch. No one thought it was odd. It was believed that this experience would teach him how to become a strong man, a capable ruler, and, most importantly, a fertile husband. To the people running the palace, the earlier he learned, the better. There are records suggesting that, in certain dynasties, boys as young as 6 or 7 were taken to these lessons. They were made to stand near the bed, often in silence. Sometimes they were allowed to ask questions afterward, but most of the time they were expected to remember what they saw and keep it to themselves. They were not given space to react emotionally. Crying or asking to leave could be seen as weakness or disobedience. Apparently, some royal educators thought the birds and the bees should come with royal curtains and live demonstrations. As the boy grew older, his role became more active. He might be assigned to assist in the sleeping chambers. These roles were sometimes labeled as bed attendants or night servants. Their official duty was to prepare the room, manage the linens, and stand ready with whatever the king or queen needed during the night. But in practice, the lines between service and exposure blurred quickly. A few of these boys were placed in situations where they saw sex happen regularly. Some had to help clean the bed after it was over. Others had to bring water for washing or oils for massaging. In some extreme cases, they were told to stay close to the bed and assist if needed. These were not professional positions. These were children who happened to be born in a palace and were told this was normal. Girls faced a different kind of expectation, while boys were trained to witness. Royal daughters were groomed to participate. From a young age, they were taught how to behave like a queen. That included learning how to become a wife. In certain courts, this process started shockingly early. There are verified accounts of royal girls being married off before they even reach puberty. Some were engaged before they turned 8. Others were sent away at 9 or 10 to live with older husbands. The idea was to secure political ties as early as possible. Whether or not the girl was physically mature did not matter. Her body was part of the diplomatic arrangement, and once she arrived in her new household, she was expected to act like a proper wife. There were instances where the marriage was ceremonial at first. The couple lived together but were not expected to consummate the union until the girl was older. However, in many cases, that line was not respected. Husbands did not always wait, and there was no real way to enforce any delay. A powerful man could take what he wanted. The girl had no protection. Some princesses were forced to share beds with their new husbands before they even knew what marriage truly meant. They bled, they cried, and they were told to be quiet. If they survived, they were praised for being obedient daughters. If they suffered, their stories were rarely written down. But sometimes the pain was visible in letters, journals, or quiet complaints from court officials who witnessed the aftermath. In modern times, this wouldn't be called education or alliance building. It would be called child abuse. There was one case in a northern European court where a 10-year-old princess was sent to marry a distant cousin. The wedding included a public ceremony, but the bedding was meant to happen privately. Her lady-in-waiting later described how the girl trembled throughout the night and had to be carried from the room the next morning. No one punished the groom. Instead, they congratulated him. This kind of treatment was normalized because it came from tradition. People thought they were protecting the family's future. If the girl gave birth to a son, the suffering was seen as worthwhile. If she didn't, the blame often fell on her. She was accused of being cold, cursed, or disobedient. Rarely did anyone question the system that put her in that position in the first place. Many of these girls never went back to their childhood homes. They stayed with their new families, often isolated and lonely. Some died young from childbirth. Others lived but carried deep emotional scars. Still, the practice continued. New generations of princesses were born and prepared to follow the same path. The palace whispered stories of past brides like bedtime tales, but the endings were rarely happy. What stands out to me is how violence was turned into ritual and trauma was called tradition. There is little doubt that these practices shaped the way royal children saw love, power, and control. They learned early that the body was a tool, that obedience was survival, and that their personal comfort meant little in the face of duty. Some grew into rulers who repeated the same practices. Others rebelled quietly, but could not change the system, as torches flickered along the stone walls, and the sounds of banquet laughter faded into the distance. Another child might be standing at the doorway of a royal chamber, waiting to be called in. What they saw next would stay with them for the rest of their lives. In the next part, we'll explore how political rivalry sometimes pushed kings to force their wives into humiliating sexual acts as punishment, not just behind closed doors, but in front of the very court that once cheered their union. If you think royal marriages were grand affairs filled with joy and celebration, you might want to look again at how some of them actually happened. In many medieval courts, marriage was not about love or companionship. It was about power. Some kings didn't marry because they liked the woman. They married because she came with a signature from another ruler. The wedding was not a family event. It was a diplomatic transaction. A princess from a neighboring kingdom might be chosen at a young age. She had never seen the man she was going to marry. She didn't speak his language. She was told it was her duty. So she packed her belongings, rode for weeks across strange lands, and arrived at a court where everything looked unfamiliar. Her father had made an agreement, and now her body was part of the deal. She was not asked what she wanted. She was just handed over. The wedding would be arranged quickly. The guests would be dressed well. The food would be fine. The bride would be wrapped in fabric that dragged along the floor. When the feast ended, the couple was taken to a room. It was large but empty. The guards stood outside. The king rarely stayed long. Sometimes he didn't even show up. But the marriage was declared complete. Apparently, a cold room and a tired girl were enough to settle political tension between kingdoms. The bride was often left alone after the first night. She wasn't given much explanation. The servants called her queen, but she didn't feel like one. Her husband did not visit. He had done what he was supposed to do. The real value was in the signature on the treaty, not the person in the dress. If she had a child, that was a bonus. If she didn't, nobody asked her twice. She was a seal on a piece of paper, nothing more. In some places, the wedding night had to be witnessed. Not the act itself, but at least the beginning. Trusted nobles were told to watch as the couple entered the room. Curtains were drawn. Doors were locked. Then the reports were written. These were kept in the archives in case someone ever challenged the marriage. The bride's word didn't matter. Only the documents did. Some courts went further. There were rumors that the wedding night was staged like a performance. Candles were placed carefully. Witnesses stood nearby. The bride was told what to do. If she refused, she was threatened. A king needed proof, not of love, but of possession. In modern terms, it was like forcing someone to smile for a photo they didn't agree to take, then using that photo to win a war. There were even instances where early forms of recording were used. Not detailed videos, but sketches, written descriptions, and in some periods, even photos. These were not meant for the public. They were stored with legal papers to remind future rulers that this woman had been claimed. Her dignity didn't matter. Her silence was expected. After the wedding, she was taken to another room. Not a royal suite, just a space where no one else entered. The windows were small, the walls were thick, a chair, a bed, maybe a chest. The food was delivered quietly. She might stay there for days. No one explained why. It was tradition. They said isolation helped her adjust, but really it just made her disappear. Some of these women never left those rooms. They stayed hidden for years. Their names remained in the family records, but they were not seen in ceremonies. They were not painted in portraits. They were not spoken of. Their usefulness had ended. To me, it's striking how many royal marriages looked more like a trade agreement than a human connection. Sometimes the bride's role didn't even include producing children. If the alliance didn't work out, she was blamed. If the king grew bored, she was ignored. In some cases, she was returned to her home country with a letter stating her failure. These letters didn't spare her feelings. They described her health, her behavior, even her body. She was judged not as a person, but as a failed investment. One bride was sent from a small kingdom in the hills to a rich empire by the sea. The journey took weeks. She arrived pale and tired. The king greeted her, then vanished. She was placed in a room and told to rest. Months passed. No one visited her. One morning, the door was locked from the outside. She stayed in that room for the next 10 years. No one remembered her name. Her marriage had fulfilled its purpose, and now she was forgotten. It's hard not to feel that the palace, for all its gold and decoration, was sometimes just a fancier kind of prison. The public never saw these things. They heard about the wedding. They cheered when the princess arrived. They watched the fireworks and admired the parade. But they didn't see the cold room, the silent meals, the tired girl waiting in her ceremonial dress. They didn't know she would never sit beside the king again. They didn't ask where she went, and in time, she stopped asking, too. Her name stayed on paper. Her image faded from memory. But the marriage had served its purpose. The alliance was stable. The borders were quiet. The men in charge were satisfied. As the candles burned low and the hallway outside her room grew quiet, she might lie awake, wondering if anyone even remembered what her voice sounded like. In the next part, we'll see what happened when sex wasn't used for diplomacy anymore, but as a weapon to crush pride and punish rivals in front of an entire court. If you think royal bedrooms were always filled with romance, candlelight, and carefully practiced courtship, the truth might take you by surprise. In some medieval royal households, sexual pleasure was tightly linked to domination, submission, and physical pain. What happened behind closed doors was not always about affection or duty. Sometimes it was about control, and sometimes it was about surrendering that control in the most deliberate way. Certain noble women were known to enjoy being tied up or whipped as part of their intimate routines. This wasn't whispered in fear or hidden in shame. It was part of what they expected and in some cases demanded. The idea of pain blending into pleasure was not new. Even in these conservative environments, silk cords and leather straps were kept discreetly in ornate boxes. Whips were not used for punishment, but for arousal. What might shock modern readers was at the time simply one of many practices hidden in the royal chambers. These women didn't necessarily see themselves as victims. For some of them, it was a source of emotional release. The noblewoman who had to act composed all day, curtsy and silence, and speak only when spoken to, might choose to reverse that order at night. She could kneel, be tied, be struck, and feel free. It didn't always come from trauma. It came from desire. It's strange how pain in some rooms of the palace was not something to fear, but something to pay extra for. Among the male royals, there were those who found equal interest in this power dynamic. Some didn't want to be in charge. They didn't want to issue orders. They wanted to be ordered around. A few princes, especially those raised in strict courts, were known to hire servants or trained companions to take on a dominant role. These roles were carefully selected. The servants might be dressed in theatrical costumes. The prince might be blindfolded, bound, and told to kneel. These arrangements were often set up through intermediaries. A trusted advisor might handle the hiring. The participants rarely spoke about it afterward, but the evidence exists. Accounts from palace staff describe the purchase of specific items. Illustrated scrolls from certain regions show figures of high status in submissive positions, arms tied, legs spread, or backs bent over padded benches. It's not just a rumor. Some of these drawings were detailed and kept in sealed collections, not for art, but for record. Today, it would be like discovering a royal photo album that belonged more in a private dungeon than a national archive. In one court, a nobleman had an entire room set aside for these preferences. The walls were lined with hooks and velvet ropes. There was a carved bench in the center and iron loops attached to the floor. The room was not marked on any floor plan. It was always kept locked. Only a handful of people had the keys. But the servants who cleaned it described the markings on the wood and the scent of wax on the surfaces. It was not a place for casual rest. Some royal partners were chosen because of these preferences. A queen consort might be selected in part because she was discreet and cooperative, but she might also be appreciated for being open to refinement, a phrase that in certain journals refer to tolerance or even enthusiasm for physical submission. These journals did not use medical or clinical language. They spoke in terms of obedience, satisfaction, and the preservation of private harmony. What stands out most is how quietly accepted it all was, provided no one tried to make it public. In some cases, Visiting royals brought their preferences with them. There are notes of foreign queens asking palace staff to install special locks on their bedposts or requesting rooms with stone floors instead of wood. These weren't random requests. They were part of a routine. Traveling with ropes and restraints wasn't scandalous if no one asked questions. The boundary between performance and intimacy often disappeared. Costumes, titles, and roles flowed into the nightly routines. A prince might crawl on the floor while being spoken to like a servant. A princess might be suspended by ropes and asked to remain still. These were not punishments. They were acts agreed upon, if not always joyfully, then at least with understanding. There is one preserved image of a royal woman blindfolded, her wrist tied behind her back, standing naked next to a basin. She was flanked by two women in robes. The caption beneath the image described her as awaiting renewal. There was no shame in the text, no warning, just a label. It was part of a personal archive. That archive now sits in a private European collection sealed in glass. I can't help but wonder what these people thought when they looked in the mirror the next morning. For all the attention paid to appearances in public, what happened in private rarely matched the polished image. Behind the jewels and embroidered robes were ropes, lashes, commands, and soft whimpers. Not all of it was harmful, but not all of it was healthy either. It was a world that ran on both ritual and release. Most of these stories remained inside the palace walls. Only the staff, the scribes, and sometimes the healers knew the full details. But fragments survive. A line in a diary, a drawing in the margins, a broken whip hidden in the lining of a chest. These fragments tell a story that was never read aloud in court, but one that echoed in its darkest rooms. As another curtain closed, and a servant quietly gathered the ropes, a different kind of power had been exercised. Not the power of politics or law, but the private power of surrender. Next, we'll look at how rituals surrounding childbirth were often inseparable from sex itself, with strange customs involving midwives, phallic charms, and forced stimulation during labor. If some believe that medieval royalty relied only on fine perfumes, gold-plated baths, and delicate oils to express their desire, they would probably not expect what was truly used behind locked doors. Among some royal families, bodily fluids, including urine, played a strange role in sexual customs. It was not a matter of hygiene. It was not punishment. It was about dominance, ownership, and ritual. The idea that a body could be marked, not with jewelry or scent, but with the raw evidence of control, was not fiction. It was part of private court routines. In more than one royal household, it was recorded that urine was not simply waste. It was a sign of possession. Some kings used it to mark the bodies of their lovers. It was done behind closed curtains, in silent rooms, and often followed an intimate encounter. The liquid would be poured or sprayed on the chest, stomach, or even thighs of the partner. Sometimes this was followed by a bath. Other times the smell was left to linger. The belief was simple. The body touched by royal urine was now bonded, sealed, and owned. It was not meant to be romantic. It was symbolic. It was about reminding the other person that they belonged to the one who had marked them. In this way, sex was no longer just physical contact. It became a method of labeling someone as private property. It's hard to imagine a perfume line today based on this principle. But in the past, the smell of power came with a sharp sting. Some royal women did not resist this practice. A few queens and noble women demanded it as part of their rituals. In one account, A queen is said to have asked her prince to urinate on her lower back before dressing for ceremonies. She believed it brought her protection, luck, and loyalty. The act was kept quiet, but was not hidden from her close servants. They were the ones who prepared the floor coverings, brought the water bowls afterward, and lit the incense to hide the scent. In another case, a young noblewoman was gifted a small bottle containing dried traces of her lover's urine. She kept it beside her mirror. According to the record, she would tap the bottle gently each night before sleep. It was not science. It was a belief. She saw it as a symbol of connection, stronger than a ring or a lock of hair. Modern relationships might rely on social media passwords and shared streaming accounts. But these royal bonds had their own less digital way of proving commitment. Even the materials used to absorb or contain the urine became special. Some couples had fine linens prepared specifically for the act. These linens were not thrown away. They were dried, folded, and stored. There are whispers that some of them were passed down quietly or hidden in family trunks. The smell, when too strong, was masked using incense, myrrh, or scented candles made with herbs like sage or frankincense. But the smell never completely vanished. That was the point. A faint trace always lingered, reminding the person of what had happened. In one letter from a chambermaid, she describes entering a room that smelled like a burnt garden mixed with something sharp and sour. She realized later that the king had spent the evening there with his consort, and the marks on the bedsheets confirm the story. Among the strangest details is that this act was not always tied to pleasure. It was sometimes performed during arguments, moments of jealousy, or after accusations of infidelity. The idea was to reclaim the partner, to reassert physical dominance in a way that could not be ignored or washed off easily. Some medical advisors in court even claimed it had cleansing effects, not in terms of physical health, but spiritual clarity. These advisors believed that the act brought submission and focus, especially in women who were seen as distracted or difficult. They prescribed it like a remedy. While not every royal followed the advice, enough did that the record survive. It's unsettling to think how private humiliation could be dressed up as healing when it came from a man in robes. The rituals also extended beyond the bedroom. Notes describing royal baths that included a few drops of urine added to the water, particularly during fertility rites. One report even mentions a queen being blessed with the urine of a virgin prince before undergoing a ritual massage. These practices were not discussed in public, but they were known among the inner circles of court attendants. What complicates these stories is the question of consent. Did all parties agree? Were they willing? Or was this simply another expectation forced onto those without power? The answer likely varies from case to case. In some relationships, the act was clearly mutual. In others, it appears to have been endured rather than chosen. There are still preserved jars labeled in old dialects that contain darkened stains and sealed lids. Some historians believe they once held the fluids of kings and queens. Their presence in private vaults and forgotten collections suggests that this aspect of court life was not isolated or rare. It was just something that never made it into the official portraits or royal biographies. These stories are not often taught in school. They live in the margins of journals, in coded language, or in the cautious notes of scholars who dare to explore what royalty did outside of the throne room. Yet, they offer a deeper understanding of how human these people truly were. Powerful, yes, but also possessive, fearful, and desperate to control what they could. And sometimes what they chose to control was the scent left on someone else's skin. Up next, we'll move into the royal rituals surrounding childbirth, where sex, pain, and blood were mixed with candles, charms, and the urgent pressure to produce an heir. Some royal families did not always rely on titles and rituals to exercise their control. There were moments when kings, queens, and princes sought a different kind of experience, one that seemed ordinary from the outside, but was fully calculated in intention. Instead of commanding from a throne or issuing orders from behind embroidered curtains, some of them put on the garments of the people they ruled and slipped through palace corridors unnoticed. These weren't innocent games of pretend. They were decisions rooted in desire, secrecy, and power. Some kings dressed like palace guards, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, wearing plain wool tunics, rough leather belts, and sandals without gold trim. They moved past servants and footmen like shadows. They did not use royal seals or heralds to announce themselves. They preferred to walk through the sleeping wings of the palace at night, entering rooms without knocking. A servant girl who had seen the king earlier in the day, robed in silk and shaded by peacock feather fans, now saw a man who looked like a stranger, quiet and commanding. His status remained, even if his appearance didn't. The illusion gave him something he couldn't have in daylight. It let him approach without being witnessed. But that didn't mean the power disappeared. It's hard to talk about consent when the man pretending to be a guard could have you executed before sunrise. There are records scattered in court documents and private letters of young maids, bearing royal children after nights like these. The children were not always acknowledged, but they were not always hidden either. Sometimes the women were sent away. Sometimes they were married off quietly, but the king remained untouched. Princes followed the same pattern. Some did it to impress each other, bragging about how many rooms they had snuck into. Others used it as a way to seduce noble women already married to their father's advisors. Wearing a servant's cloak, a prince could enter the chambers of a lord's wife and act like a messenger or a helper. What happened next often remained a secret, especially if the woman said nothing. If she resisted, the prince could simply reveal his identity and end the situation in his favor. If she gave in, whether willingly or out of fear, the entire matter would be buried by morning. In today's world, this would be viewed as a terrifying abuse of disguise and power. In those times, it was seen as clever, even charming. Some princes were praised in chronicles for their ability to move among the people, though the writers never explained what those movements actually involved. It wasn't just the men. There were queens who felt caged inside the walls of the palace. While their husbands were away or distracted, some of these royal women found ways to experience what they believed to be freedom. One common method was dressing as a commoner, leaving the palace through servant tunnels or hidden gates and entering the lower parts of the city. In the darkness of night, their jewels were replaced with fabric ribbons. Their perfume was replaced with smoke. Their names are never spoken. One royal woman is said to have entered a brothel under a false name and offered herself for coins. The men who accepted her never knew who she was. She returned before dawn, escorted by a loyal handmaid who said nothing. The queen's behavior was not discovered for months. When it was, she claimed she had been seeking true connection. Whether anyone believed her is unclear. What is clear is that she was not punished. If you ever wondered whether royalty could feel anonymous, the answer is yes, but only when they pretended to be someone they ruled. The need for this disguise tells us something important. Royal status came with control, but also with restrictions. Every movement, every word, every glance was watched. Stepping out of that role, even for a single night, gave them the illusion of release. It didn't change the structure, but it made them feel less trapped. There were even rehearsals inside palace walls. Princes practiced walking like farmers. Queens studied how maids spoke. Some nobles hired actors or prostitutes to coach them in how to behave lower. These exercises weren't meant for plays. They were 4 real nights planned in advance, where the goal wasn't safety, but a strange version of pleasure mixed with domination. In one shocking report, a nobleman describes watching his wife be approached by a man in a servant's clothing. She hesitated, but did not refuse. Only later did he recognize the man's face. The king himself, the nobleman, wrote nothing to protest. He simply noted that he could do nothing and moved on to other events. That journal still exists, in fragments held in a museum vault. It stands as quiet evidence of a truth few dared speak aloud. The boundaries between ruler and ruled were not just crossed. They were blurred on purpose. Royals enjoyed the power to switch roles, knowing they could return to their thrones whenever they pleased. No one could stop them. No law applied to them. And if things went wrong, the people around them paid the price, not them. What unsettles me is how these disguises didn't lessen the power, they magnified it. Pretending to be powerless gave them even more control. When someone with ultimate authority chooses to act like they have none, it isn't humility. It's a strategy. Eventually, some of these stories leaked into poems, songs, and gossip. People whispered about princes hiding in maid quarters or queens walking among taverns. But most accounts stayed hidden in letters, journals, or temple archives. They weren't meant to be remembered. They were meant to be erased. But enough remains to see the pattern. The need for disguise in royal sex tells us how deeply broken the system was. When the most powerful people in the land had to pretend to be powerless to feel pleasure, something was off. These weren't ordinary games. They were symptoms of a culture where hierarchy reached into the most private spaces, where even desire needed a script, a mask, and a locked door. The next part will take us even deeper into the palace's darkness, where the roles are reversed once again, and those once treated as tools become trophies and sometimes sacrifices. There were acts that even the palace did not speak of, not because they were crimes, but because they mixed 2 things that were supposed to stay separate: religion and desire. For most people in the kingdom, the idea of using something sacred for personal pleasure would be considered blasphemy. But behind the doors of royal chambers, the opposite was sometimes true. Some members of the royal family believed that spiritual objects could heighten their sexual experiences. Not only that, they thought it could bring them closer to the divine. Inside private rooms of queens and princes, among gold-trimmed mirrors and velvet pillows, were collections of items never meant for worship in the usual sense. Relics brought from churches, small statues of saints, pieces of bone believed to belong to holy men, and even wooden crucifixes. They weren't displayed for guests or stored in temples. They were used in ways that shocked even their most loyal servants. Some women in the royal household kept these objects wrapped in silk under their mattresses. Some men had them hidden in boxes, labeled as prayer kits. There are records of royal women using small saint figurines as tools for stimulation. These weren't rumors whispered by enemies. They came from the journals of ladies-in-waiting and notes from royal physicians. A carved wooden image of a bishop with a long staff or a bone fragment wrapped in cloth became more than symbolic. It became a part of personal ritual, not a public prayer, a private act. It's strange how something seen as holy could be repurposed into something so personal. Yet no one dared stop it. The royal name alone made it untouchable. If a commoner had done the same, they would have been burned or exiled. But when a queen did it, the priest chose silence. They said nothing. Some may have even assisted. There were priests assigned to the palace, men of faith who oversaw religious education, confession, and spiritual balance. Some of them were fully aware of what happened behind the curtains. They knew when a relic went missing. They recognized when a statue had been cleaned too often or returned with odd stains, but they didn't report it. Sometimes they were offered gold. Sometimes they were told it was part of a vision or ritual. Most of the time, they just turned their heads. One letter from a young clergyman described walking into a queen's chamber with a bowl of incense. He saw her kneeling at the edge of her bed, eyes closed, one hand gripping a carved ivory saint. She didn't stop. She didn't hide. She looked at him once and then continued. He wrote in his letter that he felt like an intruder in both the house of God and the house of the flesh. The letter was hidden for decades and only found when church archives were being moved centuries later. In modern terms, it would be like someone using a national flag as a personal toy and then expecting full respect from the public the next morning. The differences back then no one could criticize. Kings were chosen by God. Queens were seen as divine vessels. What they did with religious items was seen not as sin, but as mystery. Only when those mysteries became too visible did anyone raise concern. There were times when royal children stumbled upon these objects and asked questions. They were told the relics were tools for prayer. Sometimes those explanations were enough. Other times the children copied what they saw, believing it was part of becoming holy. One disturbing account from a palace servant tells of a young princess found in a linen closet holding a piece of bone to her chest, whispering words she barely understood. Some of the relics used were stolen from monasteries or purchased from traveling monks. Others were gifts from bishops, hoping to win favor. They never asked how the items were used. They only asked whether the king or queen was pleased. What happened next was not their concern. The chain of silence was thick and well guarded. There was also a belief in the healing power of sacred objects when combined with sexual release. A queen with fertility issues once confessed to her midwife that she had used a relic of Saint Agnes during nightly acts, hoping to be blessed with a son. She never conceived, but she believed the effort itself was seen by heaven. Her logic was simple. If God made the body and God made the relic, then using both together could not be wrong. To me, this shows how far belief can stretch when mixed with loneliness, power, and desperation. The royals had everything, but even they feared emptiness. Sometimes they turned to things meant for worship to fill spaces that nothing else could reach. It wasn't always about pleasure. Sometimes it was about comfort. Sometimes fear. Over time, certain priests began to specialize in providing spiritual objects that were slightly altered. Relics shaped with smooth edges, statues carved with softer curves. They claimed it was for easier handling during prayer, but everyone knew the design was deliberate. It allowed for use in other ways. These priests were never punished. Their services were kept quiet, but in high demand. There were storage rooms in some castles filled with chests of forgotten relics. When opened centuries later, they were found alongside silk cloths, jars of scented oil, and handwritten notes in faded ink. These weren't museum pieces. They were fragments of private history, silent evidence of what had once been routine behind the palace walls. None of this ever made it into the official church records. No bishop dared write that the queen had borrowed a saint's toe bone and returned it broken. No historian dared describe how a carved cross had to be replaced every month. But servants talked. Maids whispered. Guards shared stories over ale. And eventually some wrote them down. What's most surprising is not that it happened, but that it was protected so carefully for so long. No scandal, no punishment, just silence. That silence was more powerful than the law. It kept the royal image intact even when the truth was carved into wood and bone beneath their beds. In the next part, we'll turn from objects to rituals again. This time to examine what happened when sexual acts became part of political theatre, where performance was not only expected but sometimes demanded before a witness. Among the lesser-known practices of medieval royalty, there existed a dark and disturbing ritual that few ever spoke of aloud. These rites did not appear in public records or grand chronicles, but instead lived in the shadows of personal journals, hushed whispers, and forgotten corridors. In certain kingdoms, the belief that one could absorb the power or spirit of a living creature by accepting engaging with its body after death was not only tolerated, it was ritualized. The act itself was cloaked in layers of symbolism and spiritual justification. But when stripped of context, it involved sexual contact with animal corpses. Animals chosen for these rites were not random. There were often young and healthy specimens of goats, sheep, or calves, selected days in advance by court priests and animal handlers. The animals were bathed, scented with oils, and adorned with ribbons or fabric before being brought into the ceremonial space. The room itself would be dark, often lit only by oil lamps or low candles. A brazier of burning herbs filled the air with the scent of frankincense or sage, masking the underlying odor of fear and blood. When the time came, the animal would be sacrificed in a specific position. Its blood was collected in silver bowls and used to anoint ceremonial statues or altar stones. The body was not moved. It remained warm and still on the floor, laid atop a thick woven rug, sometimes marked with the royal sigil or sacred emblems. A member of the royal family, often a prince or princess preparing for a fertility rite, would approach the body. The next step was rarely discussed openly, but in some private court documents, it was described with alarming clarity. To anyone outside the palace walls, what happened next would be considered horrifying. But inside the walls of power, it was called sacred. The participant would kneel beside the still warm animal and press their body against it. In some cases, they were instructed to simulate intercourse or even perform actual penetration. The justification given was that by making intimate contact with the vessel of sacrifice, one could absorb its fertility, strength, or masculine soul. This was especially true when the ceremony involved a male animal chosen to represent virility and power. One tale that circulated for generations told of a queen who insisted on keeping the genitals of a black goat used in her personal rite. It was dried, perfumed, and sealed in a red silk pouch, which she wore around her waist on the night of her son's conception. Servants recalled seeing her whisper over it before going to bed. While this may seem like folklore, certain temple records mention similar artifacts preserved in jars and hidden in private altars. These rituals were not always carried out alone. A handful of trusted attendants or priests were often present, offering chants or musical accompaniment, ensuring the spiritual flow remained uninterrupted. No one was allowed to speak plainly of what they saw. Everything was veiled in phrases like returning to the origin or embracing the last breath of nature. But even those phrases could not fully mask the nature of the acts performed. Compared to today's standards, these ceremonies blur the line between mysticism and grotesque abuse of dominance. In medieval times, peasants could be executed for harming livestock, while kings and queens were allowed to lay bare upon their corpses in the name of fertility. These practices reinforced a hierarchy not only of people but of species. Animals were not just tools for farming or food, but vessels for divine sexual energy, at least in the minds of those who ruled. What disturbed many in the inner circle was not just the ritual itself, but how ordinary it became for those who participated. After the initial shock of their first ceremony, some young royals began to look forward to the rites. They felt it made them special, chosen, even holy. Servants whispered of princes who asked to keep animal bones in their chambers or to rub themselves with the ashes of burned sacrifice remains. The silence of the witnesses was perhaps the most unsettling part. Chambermaids washed the sheets, but never spoke of the stains. Priests prepared the incense and averted their eyes. When questions were raised by younger or more frightened participants, they were told to accept the honor of continuing the bloodline. Questioning the ritual meant questioning the gods themselves. Once the ceremony ended, the animal was burned in a secluded courtyard. Ashes were mixed with herbs and scattered in gardens or under beds, depending on the intended spiritual effect. The remains of the animal were considered potent. In some cases, they were pressed into tablets or wax seals that were worn during intercourse with human partners, as a way to continue the channeling. As years passed, some rites became less physically explicit and more symbolic, but in the most secretive courts, the original form endured. A stone room beneath the palace, a still warm body on embroidered rugs, a naked figure kneeling beside it. These scenes repeated across generations, carried out in silence, protected by power, and sanitized by religious language. It's both sad and terrifying how easily human dignity can be suspended when tradition wraps itself in holiness. The royal family was never questioned, and the animals had no voice. What might be seen as perverse in any other setting became in these palaces the echo of divine command for those involved. The ritual was not only acceptable, it was vital. This belief in the sacred sexuality of beasts did not end here. The boundary between animal and human, between death and arousal, was blurred further in another form of royal custom, one where the living human body itself became the altar. In the next chamber, beneath flickering torchlight, the final rites of bodily surrender awaited. There were many reasons medieval royal families believed they had to manipulate the act of sex itself, and not all of them had to do with desire or dominance. In some corners of medieval courts, strange postures and uncomfortable positions were not signs of pleasure, but rituals of prevention. When a royal woman was expected to bear a child, but the timing was inconvenient. Some kings relied on contorted sexual customs they believed would prevent conception. These positions had nothing to do with anatomy or science. They came from superstition, and they often left behind both physical pain and emotional confusion. Queens were sometimes instructed to lie with their heads tilted down, sometimes even touching the cold stone floors of palace chambers, while their legs were tied or suspended upwards. The belief was that this angle would stop the seed from reaching its destination. Whether the queen consented was not the point. This was her duty. The act was scheduled, the setup was arranged, and all she had to do was remain still and let the ritual unfold. In some cases, 2 servants were assigned to keep her ankles secured by ropes to the wooden beams above. turning a royal chamber into a place that felt more like a workshop than a bedroom. It's hard to imagine this scene and not think of how little it resembled anything tender or romantic. There were no candles lit for warmth, no soft words exchanged before or after. The queen might be shivering, eyes focused on a single crack in the wall, waiting for it to end. The king, on the other hand, was often convinced he was following divine instructions by manipulating gravity. He believed he was manipulating fate. If the child did not come, it meant the ritual had worked. If she did become pregnant, someone would claim she moved too soon or the ropes weren't tight enough. What makes this worse is that it wasn't limited to the queen. Young concubines, often girls under 15, were subjected to even more bizarre setups. There was one position referred to in royal handbooks as the crab crawl. It required the girl to arch backward with hands and feet on the ground, barely facing upward, while the king mounted her from above. This was supposed to ensure that no semen remained in the correct place to cause pregnancy. No concern was given to the girl's comfort or health. She was there to serve. Her back ached, her arms shook, but no one stopped to ask how it felt. It's almost impressive, in the worst way possible, how much effort medieval kings put into not learning basic biology. Instead of understanding menstrual cycles or fertility windows, they built entire rituals around posture and direction. They trusted omens and ignored anatomy. They invented sexual techniques that sounded more like torture than intimacy and passed them down as family tradition. Some kings took their beliefs even further. They believed that certain places had spiritual power and that having sex in those spaces would protect them from karmic punishment. The altar was one such place. While it might sound shocking, some kings would demand that their chosen partner lie on a sacred platform used for worship. It could be a stone slab in a temple, a family shrine, or even a chamber adorned with sacred symbols. The idea was that by mixing divine space with carnal act, the soul would be protected from any sin. The body was used, but the soul remained clean. Or so they thought. Today, people worry about privacy and consent. Back then, the worry was about heaven and hell, and it justified nearly everything. Some altars were stained, not with wine or incense, but with fluids from royal rituals that no one dared to question. The priests were often complicit. If they objected, they risked losing their position or even their lives. Silence was safer, even if it meant watching a child or a queen reduced to an object. Witness accounts were rare. Most of what we know comes from unofficial records or letters that never made it to public archives. But hints remain. A fragment of a confession from a servant, a crude drawing hidden in a book margin, a complaint from a midwife who refused to return after one visit. The stories are scattered, but they fit together. They tell of a time when kings saw their bodies as instruments of divine will and everyone else's bodies as extensions of their authority. One might think that with all the effort to prevent pregnancy, kings didn't want heirs. That wasn't true. They wanted children, but only under the right astrological signs, on the right lunar day, or with the right woman. Timing was everything. Some believed that if a child was conceived upside down, he would be born clever. Others feared that a boy born of a crab-crawl union would become rebellious. The logic shifted constantly. There was no consistency, just fear and power. There's something deeply unsettling about how routine this all became. Not just the strange positions, but the way no one questioned them. Not the queens, not the priests, not the doctors. It was just how things were done. No one called it cruelty. It was considered caution. They did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as careful. Reading this, I can't help but feel a quiet horror at how normalized it all must have felt at the time. In rooms built of gold and marble, pain was disguised as obedience, and fear dressed itself in ritual. As we move forward, the next part takes us deeper into how royal women were expected to prepare their bodies for these sexual acts. Cleanliness, fertility, rituals, and spiritual grooming were just the beginning. Inside medieval palaces, pleasure was not always about spontaneity. For certain kings, intimacy had to follow a precise pattern, and that included wardrobe. These monarchs were not simply aroused by the body, but by what that body represented. The role, the costume, the illusion. The partner could be a concubine, a slave, or even a noblewoman. But none of that mattered unless she wore what the king asked for. Sometimes that meant the exact gown his late queen used to wear. The color had to match. The hemline had to fall at the same angle. The scent of old perfume clinging to the fabric had to be present. This was not about grief. It was about power. The body became a stage. The bed became a theater. This was not limited to mourning or memory. It extended into ritual. Some kings demanded that their partners change costumes multiple times in a single encounter. The woman would enter the room in one outfit, perform part of the act, then pause, step behind a screen, and emerge again dressed differently. Sometimes as a peasant girl, sometimes as a nun, sometimes in armor or in a dress from a conquered land. The changes were not random. Each had a meaning, a fantasy, a political message. The king was not just sleeping with someone. He was reenacting a conquest, a reunion, a punishment, or a temptation. The bedroom was scripted like a morality play. At that point, it's hard to tell whether the king needed a lover or a costume designer. In the royal records that survived, there are indirect references to closets attached to the private bedchambers. These were not storage rooms for food or books. They were dressing areas full of silk, velvet, fur, leather, and robes in styles that matched different roles in society. Some closets had outfits sized for women who had already died. Others had garments designed just for sex, not for public wear. The women who served the king intimately had to learn how to act as well as how to please. They needed to walk differently, speak differently, and know when to undress. Some even had to learn old court dances or gestures from a past queen's habits. It was less about desire, more about accuracy. One disturbing pattern involved the repeated use of sibling roles. There are stories where the king insisted his partner address him by his childhood nickname. In one case, a concubine was dressed in the robe of the king's sister, complete with her childhood jewelry and embroidered shoes. The entire scene was arranged to evoke an earlier time when the king was not yet ruler. The act was less about lust and more about regaining control. He was not making love to a person. He was dominating a memory. Compared to modern role play, this crossed into something far more rigid and far less voluntary. Slaves had no choice. They were trained and dressed by other women in the harem. They were expected to stay silent during costume changes. Some endured these rituals several times a week, forced to rotate identities. One day a royal consort, the next day a village girl, then perhaps the image of a saint or priestess, all under the gaze of the king. There were times when even noble women had to comply. If they had married into the court from another kingdom, they might be made to wear the clothing of their husband's mother or former wife. The intention was not humiliation, but control. The king was restyling their image to fit what he believed royal femininity should be. In private correspondence from some nobles who visited foreign courts, these practices were sometimes mentioned in code. Words like ceremonial undressing, triple garments, or hall of transformation hinted how central clothing was to erotic ritual. One letter mentions that a certain lady had to leave the room twice during a royal night and re-enter each time in new attire, never saying a word. Another speaks of a chambermaid helping her mistress into the widow's veil before being summoned. These details may sound theatrical today, but they were taken seriously at the time. They were part of the script of obedience. It also affected the architecture. Some palaces had corridors leading directly from the queen's apartments to the tailor's room. It was not only about public appearances at court. It was also about what she would wear behind closed doors. Seamstresses worked at night to modify gowns based on the king's instructions. Fabrics were imported specifically for this purpose, chosen for their softness or sheen under candlelight. Some were even perfumed in advance. There's a strange irony in how much effort went into pretending to be someone else only to serve the same man every time. There were times when these practices blurred the lines between fantasy and mental obsession. In at least one case, a king refused to bed his new wife unless she agreed to wear a dress identical to the one his first queen wore on their wedding night. She resisted and the marriage was delayed. Eventually, she gave in, but letters reveal she never forgot that first night. Not because it was passionate, but because she felt erased, like her role was to resurrect someone, not to be herself. Seeing all this, it becomes clear that these costumes were not about beauty or seduction. They were uniforms, tools, extensions of royal dominance. The king was not asking for permission. He was dictating the terms of intimacy down to the fabric. And for women in the palace, this meant their worth was stitched into seams, buttons, and hemlines. It's difficult not to feel how suffocating that must have been, wearing someone else's identity just to survive in a world where power demanded submission in every form. Even the body had to be dressed in memories it did not own. As we move closer to the end of the story, one final practice remains. It is darker, more private, and more lasting than fabric and fantasy. We now step into the moment after death, where even a royal corpse was not left in peace. In the royal chambers, where everything appeared refined and sacred, not even the bedsheets were free from ritual. At first glance, they were made of the finest linen, hand-stitched by skilled servants. But when examined closely, some of these sheets revealed a strange and unsettling design. In the very center of certain royal beds, there was a perfectly cut hole. It wasn't a flaw or a mistake. It was intentional. These sheets were sewn that way for a reason. In some palaces, sexual acts between royal couples were only allowed to occur through that hole, with the sheet covering the rest of their bodies. To modern eyes, it looks more like a theatrical magic trick than intimacy. But for the medieval royal families, it was about control and appearance. They believed that even during sex, a monarch must preserve dignity. Looking into each other's eyes, touching hands, or even hearing a breath too close might be considered too human, too weak. Royals weren't supposed to show lust or affection like commoners. So, the fabric became a barrier, a way to separate desire from duty. It was often said that the bed was not for love, but for lineage, and the use of these modified sheets reinforced that belief. A king would lie on one side, a queen on the other. Their bodies met only through the opening. No kissing, no talking, no warmth exchanged. The act itself was stripped of pleasure, performed like a sacred obligation. When finished, both were expected to turn away, clean themselves in silence, and returned to their daily roles as rulers. The sheet was then taken away and cleaned, sometimes even stored as evidence. In certain cases, these special sheets were not just used for one night. They were passed down like relics. Some were embroidered with symbols, prayers, or red thread. When a princess was expected to marry and consummate her union, a new sheet was made with a small patch of red embroidery near the center hole. This was not for beauty. It was meant to absorb and record her blood. The first time of a royal bride was not just private. It was documented and the proof was kept. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your wedding night would leave a stain meant to be seen by others. It wasn't always about joy or union. Sometimes it was a test. Servants were told to watch the sheets in the morning. Elders inspected the linen for the expected mark. If there was no blood, the princess could be questioned. Had she lost her virginity earlier? Was she hiding something? Rumors could ruin reputations, even when the absence of blood meant nothing at all. The ritual of the royal sheet went hand in hand with a culture of silence. These acts were never talked about openly, but everyone in the palace knew. The servants knew, the midwives knew, the priests knew, and still they participated. They carried the sheets in and out. They whispered in the corridors. They changed the bedding without comment, even if it reeked of sweat, blood, or something else entirely. It became part of the daily rhythm of court life. In some rare instances, these sheets became tools of manipulation. A noble might try to falsify the signs on the cloth to protect a bride's honor or to accuse an enemy's daughter. There are accounts of red dye being dabbed onto fabric. Some claim to have seen blood that never came from the body. But in a world where purity determined political alliances, the linen on a bed could carry more power than a royal seal. Compared to today's privacy-focused world where bedroom matters stay behind closed doors, this was an open secret that everybody tiptoed around. Yet no one spoke out. There were no protests, no objections. Not because people didn't feel discomfort, but because they didn't have the space to question the system. Intimacy for royal women especially was never theirs to define. It belonged to the institution, the bloodline, the image of divine authority. Some of these sheets survive in fragments in museums today, yellowed with age, stitched with fine but faded thread. They seem like simple linens, but to a historian, they speak volumes. They tell us about fear, about power, about the ways in which the body was both ripped and controlled. Behind the palace walls, where gold shimmered and incense burned, sex was not an act of love. It was a ceremony, cold, calculated, observed. And so we close this journey through the disturbing, often hidden world of medieval royal sexuality, from incest and necrophilia to symbolic bedsheets and forced rituals. What lies beneath the crowns and velvet robes is not always noble. It is raw, it is strange. It is human in the most uncomfortable sense of the word. These stories are not meant to mock the past, but to understand it. The royals believed they were upholding divine order. In truth, many were trapped in roles that stripped them of genuine connection. They lived in fear of impurity, of scandal, of failure to produce a worthy heir. And in that fear, they invented rules that turned desire into duty and love into protocol. What haunts me most is not the violence or the taboo, but the quiet acceptance that surrounded it all. No one screamed. No one ran. The palace remained calm. The rituals continued, and the sheets kept being changed. Tonight, as we leave behind the cold marble halls and return to the softness of our beds. Perhaps we can take with us one simple thought, that history is not just made of wars and treaties, but also of whispers in the dark, of rituals no one questioned, of sheets no one dared to lift. Thank you for staying with us through this strange and haunting journey. May your night be free of royal burdens. May your sleep be soft and your dreams untouched by the shadows of the past. Good night.